So welcome. This is a kind of a repeat of a session I did back on June 5th on what's going on with the United Methodist Church. There's been a few changes since then on what's going on, but I'll try to bring you up to date on what I know is going on. But to do this, one of the things I thought would be helpful was to kind of give a background of some of our past that brings us up to today. So of course, the Methodist Church, or at that time it was called the Methodist Episcopal Church of North America. It was founded in 1784. And since its founding, we've gone through several periods of splintering and separating and reconnecting. Almost immediately, well, in 1792, there was a first schism that happened. A group broke off, upset over the bishop's authority to appoint clergy. They wanted that to be subject to a vote of the conference, and that was voted down, and so the group splintered off. And another big split happened in 1828 when the Methodist Protestant Church broke off. I mentioned them because we'll come back to them. Or maybe I'll call those more splinters, but the biggest split in the denomination occurred in 1844. And that's when the church split into a northern and a southern branch just prior to the Civil War. The spark that led to that split was slavery, and the specific event that triggered it was that the General Conference voted to suspend a southern bishop until he gave up his slaves. He had inherited some slaves through his marriage, and the church said, we can't have a bishop that owns slaves, and they suspended him, and that led to the split that occurred in 1844 between the Methodist Episcopal Church and then the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Prior to that split in 1844, there'd been a couple other splinter groups that had broken, well, several other that had broken off over the issue of slavery and other things. The two biggest groups that broke off, that names you'd recognize, would be the Nazarenes, the Church of the Nazarenes, broke off from the Methodists prior to that over the issue of slavery, and the Free Methodists as well. Those were both actually anti-slavery groups, but they had other issues as well, theological issues, the role of bishops, ownership of property, and such. After the Civil War ended, attempts to, or talks at least, to reunify started, but it took until 1939 until that split that occurred pre-Civil War was mended, and the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, and the Methodist Protestant Church, that group that broke off in 1828, those three groups came back together, merged together, and at that time named it the Methodist Church. So we dropped the Episcopal Church name at that time. But there were compromises that were made to come back together. So there were several issues. The Southern Church was weakened after the Civil War, and there was concern that they didn't have the votes and the power to kind of control their own destiny, and that the northern states might elect bishops that would come in and force them to segregate, or to integrate, excuse me, and things such as that. So part of the compromise, I guess, for the merger was that the denomination created 6 jurisdictional conferences. These are regional areas. And the main function in those regional areas would be the election of bishops. Prior to that, the General Conference elected bishops, but now they would be done by regions. So we had a northeastern region, a southeastern region, north central region, south central region, and a western region. And then there was a 6th jurisdiction that was compromised the entire US, and it was a Black jurisdiction. Again, concern over integration. So the compromise was to put all the Black churches into their own jurisdiction that encompassed the entire United States. And then what would be predominantly white churches would be in the regional jurisdictions. Each jurisdiction would elect their own bishops. Each jurisdiction would have control over their bishops. If charges were brought against their bishops, the jurisdiction would decide how those charges would be discharged, so that, you know, the Northern Church couldn't come into the South and remove Southern bishops who maybe were adhering to segregation or such. Now, I bring this up because this is one of the issues that is leading to some of the unrest in the church today. This compromise in 1939 to satisfy the segregationists in the South that created the jurisdictions still remains. In 1968, the Methodist Church, that new denomination, merged with the Evangelical Brethren Church, and at that point we became the United Methodist Church. They kept the jurisdictions, although they did away with the black jurisdiction. So we dropped just to 5 jurisdictions at that point, but each jurisdiction elects their own bishop, controls their bishops. If their bishops are charged with anything, they control what happens there. Also in 1968, when the new denomination was formed, they set up a commission, the General Conference set up a commission to develop a set of social principles that would be brought back to the 1972 General Conference to be considered and voted on. The social principles, whoops, I grabbed the wrong book. The social principles are defined as being for study and for exploration. Sorry, my bookmark got moved. That the social principles are not to be considered church law, but are a prayerful and thoughtful effort on the part of General Conference to speak to human issues in the contemporary world from a sound biblical and theological foundation. So they brought back this set of social principles that had sections on the world community, the political community, human community, and others. And in that, there was a statement in the section on human sexuality. There was a statement in the proposed social principles that said, "We declare our acceptance of homosexuals as persons of sacred worth, and we welcome them into the fellowship of the church. Further, we insist that society ensure their human and civil rights." This actually went through the legislative process of General Conference, and it came through that. But when it got out into the entire body for a vote, there was a group, I believe connected with the Good News movement that I'll talk about in a moment, that was concerned about that. Now, I should set this up by saying that 1968 was really kind of the start or the height of kind of the development of the gay rights movement in the United States. The Stonewall Riots happened in 1969. So 68 we started, 69 Stonewall Riots, and 72 when these social principles came. This is what's going on in the United States. So this is part of the background for this statement. When it got to the floor, there was concern over that, even though it came through legislation. And in floor debate, first there was an amendment made to take out the term homosexual persons, that we declare our acceptance of homosexuals as persons of sacred worth, and replace that with the phrase all persons. All persons have sacred worth. And then there were other changes that were made. There was a statement about supporting homosexual persons. They changed that to caring. Back and forth things went. And then finally a lay delegate from Southwest Texas, who was concerned that the church was maybe caving on their morals, decided that the church really needed to make a statement against homosexuality rather than in support of homosexual persons. And he moved the adoption of language that said, though we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider this practice incompatible with Christian doctrine. There was a substitute motion to go with even harsher language, saying that the church resolved to stand firm in the belief that the Bible condemns the practice of homosexuality, and it calls upon the church to expand the study of the relation and the cause and the cure of homosexuality. That was voted down. The original amendment was approved. After the lunch break, they evidently came back and they changed Christian doctrine to Christian teaching, because it was determined that the General Conference couldn't change Christian doctrine, that Christian doctrine is established over time, but they could make a statement about Christian teaching. And so the statement that went into the Book of Discipline read this way: that we insist all persons are entitled to have their human and civil rights ensured, though we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. And that last phrase, the incompatible with Christian teaching, is what's often referred to as the incompatibility clause. It went into the Book of Discipline in 1972, or into the social principles, which are a part of the Book of Discipline. And pretty much every General Conference since 1972 has, in one way or another, had legislation brought forward to remove the incompatibility clause, to change the incompatibility clause, to strengthen the language around homosexuality. It's been a debate for every General Conference that we've had. Over time, clergy and others started being brought up on charges for being homosexual. Original argument was, since the social principles are not church law, you can't, it's not a chargeable offense. So language started moving from the social principles into other parts of the Book of Discipline that claim that homosexual persons are not allowed to be ordained or appointed as pastors of the United Methodist Church, that forbid pastors or churches from participating in same-gender union ceremonies. Of course, this was before the Supreme Court had ruled that same-sex marriage was allowed. So over time, the language kept strengthening. Protests disrupted. In I'm trying to think, get my timeline in my head. Must have been 1996. When General Conference. Let me go back a bit. In 1992, the General Conference set up a study group to look at the church language, and to come back with a proposal, because there had been so much unrest over this. The group recommended to the 1996 General Conference that the incompatibility clause be removed, finding that there was no biblical or theological support for that statement. This was a group of scholars and others that the church put together to look at this. Once again, the legislation made it through the legislative group to take that out, but once it got to the floor, through parliamentary procedure and different things, minority resolutions came forward and such, and the incompatibility clause was kept in the Book of Discipline. There have been other attempts over the years. One year, an attempt was made to remove from the Book of Constitution, from the Constitution of the Church, language that currently says, I don't have it in front of me, that all persons, regardless of sex, race, economic status, and so on, are eligible for membership. Several years, sexual orientation was attempted to be added to that for years. That was always voted down. So they went the other route and said, let's just remove everything, say all persons are eligible to join the church. That was voted down because conservatives were concerned that that was a way to include LGBTQI plus persons. So some people just say, well, why can't we just say all are welcome here? Well, we tried that once. Conservatives voted it down because not all are considered welcome in some areas of the church. So that's been kind of the history of that. I want to go back to some of these groups. I mentioned the Good News Movement. It formed in 1967, the year before the United Methodist Church was formed. It was made up of folks that were concerned that the traditional Methodist, the mainline Methodist group, was becoming too secular in its view, too supportive of scripture and such. So it basically predates the United Methodist Church by a year, or by a year. Other groups, the Confessing Movement, the Institute of Religion and Democracy, all these conservative groups have formed over the years, have fought against what they see as the secularization of the church and the watering down of biblical standards and such, and have been the groups that have been behind strengthening the language against the inclusion of LGBTQ plus persons. You might remember back in the early 90s, I think around 92, the United Methodist Women had a conference. I think it was called Images of God was the name of their conference. But one of the images that was lifted up in this conference was the image of God as Sophia, which comes from the book of Proverbs that talks about wisdom. The Hebrew word for wisdom is Sophia. Wisdom was with God at the creation of the world. And it uses the language that's very similar. Well, actually, the book of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and with God, the Logos language there, probably came from this passage of Proverbs because it's very similar. So one of the images of God that the Women's Conference pushed was the idea of God as Sophia, God as woman. That enraged, folks in these conservative groups on what we can usually call the right. And over time, they've created their own mission society. They've created their own women's society where they've encouraged women in conservative Methodist churches to give their money to these groups, to join these groups, not to support the Global Board of Mission, but to support their mission society, not to support United Methodist Women, but to support their mission society. So they've been working over time to create a more conservative structure. And these conservative groups a few years back, I can't tell you the exact year, kind of all came together and formed what's known as the Wesleyan Covenant Association, the WCA. So even though many of those groups still exist independently, they also are part of the Wesleyan Covenant Association in some way. There were also groups on the other side that formed, mainly the Reconciling movement and the Methodist Federation for Social Action. Over time, knowing that they couldn't get the language of the general church changed, what the Reconciling movement attempted to do was to get local churches to declare themselves reconciling, declare themselves open and affirming of LGBTQI persons. And I know that pre-COVID, Whitney was looking at that possibility of declaring themselves reconciling. COVID kind of set that back. The Church Council is looking at where the interest is in revising that movement. But again, it was just basically churches saying that regardless of what the general church says, we declare ourselves open and affirming for LGBTQI persons. We accept them into our leadership and move on. So those are kind of the groups at the end. Catch up in my notes here where I'm at. So as things became more and more contentious, as groups on the right and the left pushed more and more to change language, there have been protests at different years, there's been walkouts, there have been arrests. As we came into the 2016 General Conference in Portland, Oregon, well, there's been talk about splitting for years. The Good News movement has talked about breaking up the church for a number of years, that it was time to split over this disagreement. The General Conference kept saying, no, we're not going to split. In 2016, coming in, it seemed clear that just kind of the attitude, well, there was something in the air that it was not going to go well. There was some really strong anti-gay legislation that was put forward that included harsher punishments for LGBTQI persons and those who accommodated them. It would remove a lot of the due process we have if clergy is brought up on charges for any cause. There's a due process that was followed, but some of this language would say, unless the charge was for being homosexual, and then basically due process goes away. So there was a lot of anti-gay legislation coming forward. There was also a group of clergy that came out just prior to General Conference 2016, 111 LGBTQ clergy who signed an open letter to the church saying, that we are here, we're serving your church, we're called by God to serve the church, and we're not going anywhere. It was kind of an attempt to let the church know that homosexuals are part of the leadership of the church. It was also a state of solidarity, idea being that, okay, if you're going to start charging clergy, here's 111 names to charge, go for it. And so I was one of the signers of that letter. The group, shortly after the letter came out, it grew and grew, and they kind of stopped the formal process of adding more names, but it was up over 200 clergy at one point. So when we went into General Conference in 2016, through the legislative process, a lot of that anti-gay legislation passed, and it became evident probably it's going to go out onto the floor, and it's going to get passed. It's going to become part of the Book of Discipline. Folks were concerned over that on really both sides, because they saw a split coming, didn't want to split. They kept pleading with the bishops to do something. The bishops kept saying, our hands are tied. We don't have a legislative role in this body. We just preside over the meeting, but we can't do anything. Finally, some legislation was offered on the floor that basically would stop moving forward on any of that legislation. In 2016, it directed the bishops to form a study commission on human sexuality, although the only issue that was being discussed was LGBTQI persons. And to take all this legislation, the study committee would look at it. They were called the Commission on the Way Forward. They were charged with coming up with a way that the church could move forward on this area with all of our disagreements. And when they came up with their proposal, the bishops were to call a special general conference prior to the 2020 general conference, where this legislation could be presented and we could supposedly come together as a church and find a way forward. The group was formed before it was formed, the 2016 General Conference adjourned. In some annual conferences, bishops began bringing charges once again against clergy, including some of those who were the signers of the letters. The Western Jurisdictional Conference, General Conference always meets a month or two before, a couple months before jurisdictional conferences, and so then they go in and elect bishops. When the Western jurisdiction met in 2016 to elect bishops, from the start, the lead candidate for bishop was Karen Olivito, who is a out married lesbian. It took several ballots, but ultimately she was elected bishop in the Western jurisdiction, the first out, not the first LGBTQ bishop, but the first out LGBTQ bishop elected. Immediate upon her election, delegates in the South Central jurisdiction passed a motion challenging her election, challenging it, sending it to Judicial Council, which is kind of our Supreme Court, saying that the discipline did not allow a lesbian to be bishop, then she should be removed. And this gets us to where things are going clear back to when the jurisdictions was formed. Each jurisdiction governs their own bishops. Even before 2016, the consensus in the Western jurisdiction, both from the delegates that would attend the jurisdiction and then those who were elected bishops, was that the Western jurisdiction would no longer bring charges or take any action against out queer clergy. And so as charges were brought against Bishop Olivito, the other active bishops, which make up the College of Bishops, which are who would process those charges, just determined they weren't going to do anything with them. Other jurisdictions were upset, but again, we set up this structure back to in 1939 to appease the Southern Church that each jurisdiction has control over their own bishops. So there was nothing they could do. The Judicial Council met and said, yes, by church law, she shouldn't be serving as a bishop. It's up to the bishops of the Western jurisdiction what happens. The Western jurisdiction bishops said, nothing's going to happen. So this has increased the tension in the church. So that special jurisdictional or general conference that I talked about was called in 2019. It met in St. Louis in February of 2019. Before they got into the Way Forward Commission had looked at three alternatives of a way forward. One was called the One Church Plan, where it basically would remove the incompatible clause. It would, I take that back, it might not have moved the incompatible clause, but it allowed local churches to determine their stance on the issue. So if a church wanted to say, we're open and affirming and we have no problem with a gay clergy, that was fine. Other churches could take the opposite stance. Annual conferences could take that stance. Bishops could take that stance, and no longer would they be brought up on charges if they were in an area where that was okay. That was ultimately, that's a very simplistic description of the One Church Plan. That was ultimately the plan that the commission put forward. They also considered what was considered the traditional plan, which was basically all this legislation that was submitted in 2016 and stopped voting on, to basically just adopt all of that and to come down, say very clearly that as a denomination, this is where we are, and to remove gay and lesbian clergy and bring charges against anyone performing same-sex marriage or anything. The third plan was, I don't remember the name for it, but it basically kind of formed three sub-churches in the United Methodist Church, one which was open and affirming, one which was kind of in the middle, and one which took a very harsh stance against. The commission early on just said that won't work. They rejected the traditional language, said that's what brought us to this point in 2016, and they put forward the One Church Plan. That was to be voted on in 2019. The notion being voted on and adopted. Before they got to that legislation, WestPath, which is our pension agency and health program in the church, submitted legislation knowing, this is probably not going to go well. We're probably getting to the point where we're going to have a breakup in the church. we need to protect the pension plan for clergy. And so they put forward legislation that basically said any church that leaves a denomination needs to fully fund their unfunded pension liability before they can withdraw, so that the remaining denomination was not left with a lot of clergy on pensions and no churches to fund that. So that legislation was put out there. There was also legislation, and I think it was separate from the West Path, that allowed annual conferences to regain money from churches that left the denomination, at least maybe 2 years worth of their apportionments, so that we didn't have this mass exodus of churches and all of a sudden annual conferences were broke, but it would give them a couple of years worth of apportionment funding to restructure and do what they needed to do. When we went into legislation on the floor, a substitute motion was brought forward to, instead of the one church plan, to adopt the traditional plan, the one that had been rejected by the commission. That was adopted by a small margin. The traditionalist plan became the legislation on the floor, the one that was going to, people stopped legislative action on in 2016 because they were concerned of it and what it would do to the church. That was ultimately the plan that came forward and the plan that was adopted in 2019. And so when that special session ended in 2019, basically conservatives, I think, thought, we won this, and said, progressives, it's time for you to leave the church. You've lost. Progressives basically said, no, it's our church, we're not leaving, we're going to continue to stay and fight for a more open and inclusive church. And if you want us to go, you're going to have to bring charges and remove us and go through all of that process. So it left us basically where we were before, more divided than ever, but all still in the same denomination. And one of the areas where it became most problematic was in the United States. About in 2016, about 40% of the delegates to General Conference came from outside the United States. And that was the same delegation that made up 2019. It was calculated that probably 65%, around 65% of US delegates voted against the traditional plan. So the majority of the US church was against the traditional plan, but it passed because of support from overseas. So what happened is once 2019 ended, everybody went back. They found out in the United States this was not popular. Anyway, so we ended up in this stalemate again. So immediately groups started putting forward legislation that was to come before the 2020 General Conference. And a group of progressives and moderates came together and worked with this high-powered negotiator lawyer, and they came up with what they called the Protocol on Reconciliation and Grace, a Protocol of Reconciliation and Grace through Separation. So it was supposed to be a legislated separation of the church. The issue has always been, up till this legislation, it looked like the church was going to split, but it wasn't going to split through legislation. What was going to happen at that point when people left? There is something in the United Methodist Church called the Trust Clause. It goes back to John Wesley, which declares that local churches own their property in trust for the entire denomination. And so they can't take their property with them and leave the denomination, because they keep it in trust for the entire denomination. And so if a local congregation was to leave, their property stays with the denomination. That's basically is what has kept us from splitting up until this point. With the North-South split over slavery, it stayed with the denomination, but there was a northern denomination and a southern. So the protocol on reconciliation and grace through separation basically was a legislated split, and it was it provided $25 million to conservatives, to the WCA, Wesleyan Covenant Association, to start their own denomination. And then it would provide another $2 million to other groups who wanted to leave the denomination. So conservatives would get $25 million to start a denomination, the WCA denomination. And anybody else who wanted to split, conservative, liberal, for whatever reason, they would amongst themselves divide $2 million. This was put forward and supposed to be, what would pull us out of this, and was going to be the legislation that would be adopted in 2020. Well, that's kind of what they said about the One Church plan too, but not everybody was happy with this legislation. Alternative legislation was being formulated that would do different things. The Christmas Covenant was one of the more popular ones, but just a number of proposals. General Conference was supposed to meet in May 2020. We were moving forward into this. No one really knew what was going to happen. And then we know that in March of 2020, everything just shut down. So General Conference was postponed because not only were things closed down in the United States, but over 40% of our delegates came from outside the United States. They couldn't get into the country because of COVID restrictions. How do you have a general conference when that large a percentage of your delegates can't be there to vote and to take action? It was postponed till September 2021. So we moved into 2021. It became clear that that wasn't going to happen then either. It was still not safe to meet. There's still restrictions on travel. They looked at meeting by internet, but that was ruled out for many reasons, one of which is the lack of reliable internet connections for many of those in Africa and Philippines and other parts. So they delayed again till May of 2022. We'll delay and we'll meet in 2022. The new day came. For a while, it looked like that might happen, but at the start of 2022, we saw COVID numbers climb again. There were still many parts of Africa and other areas where it was tough to get a visa to get into the States. The Commission on General Conference met and said, a lot of our overseas delegates aren't going to be able to get visas in time. It wouldn't be a fair conference to meet in May of 2022. So they decided to postpone once again, and this time they just postponed until the year 2024. So at this point, the 2020 General Conference is supposed to be held in 2024. They didn't cancel the 2020 General Conference. I don't think they had the authority to do that, but they could postpone it. I think the idea is that when the 2020 General Conference meets in 2024, they will then cancel the 2024 General Conference, and then we'll have a 2028 one. But this created some problems for some folks, because in 2019, as part of the legislation that was adopted in that special General Conference, there was a special disaffiliation process that was approved that would allow churches who were upset about the church's stance on homosexuality, either because they disagreed with language that had been put into the Book of Discipline, or because they were upset the other side that their annual conference or their bishop was not enforcing that language in the way that they should. It would allow them to disaffiliate from the denomination and take their property with them, kind of suspending the trust clause. this special period of disaffiliation ends December 31st, 2023. The thinking at the time was, in 2020, we'll adopt this plan that will give the WCA $25 million to start a new denomination, and then all these churches can disaffiliate and join the WCA. Because 2020 General Conference didn't meet, that money wasn't there. There was no new church. What were they going to do? So when the postponement was announced in early 2022 that General Conference would not happen this year, the WCA, which basically had their new denomination up and ready to go. They've been in the process, as I said, for years of getting it ready to go. They've had their own mission society, their own women's group. They have their own structure. They went ahead and said, we're going to start our new denomination May 1st of this year. So in May 1st, 2022, the Global Methodist Church, the GMC, was started. It allows churches, it's a place for churches to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church and go to, but it doesn't provide them the money they want. Some churches are entering the process of disaffiliation. Disaffiliation doesn't say that you have to join the GMC if you disaffiliate. You can disaffiliate because you're upset over the church's stance on homosexuality, one way or the other. And what you do at that point is up to your congregation. You're just no longer United Methodist. So some join the Global Methodist Church, some become independent. There are liberal churches that are leaving who are set on the other side. They're not going to join the GMC, and they're doing different things. Some have, maybe a congregation has joined the UCC and become a UCC church or whatever. So this is happening. The deadline to do this is 2023. Each annual conference kind of controls their disaffiliation. For a church to disaffiliate, they have to pay their unfunded liability for pensions. They have to provide a couple years worth of annual conference payments, that legislation that passed. And then they have to follow the process set out by their annual conference. Some annual conferences are setting out very strict and expensive processes to follow, and others have been more, as long as you pay the apportionments you owe and the unfunded liability you owe, and you have these votes, you can take your property with you. So it varies from annual conference to annual conference how that is handled. In the Greater Northwest, which is the Oregon-Idaho Conference, the Pacific Northwest Conference, and the Alaska Missionary Conference, there is a process that is outlined on our website on what you have to follow in a timeline. But it all has to be completed by the end of 2023, and it ultimately requires a vote of the annual conference to disaffiliate. So the bishop, when she presented this, said, I will call a special annual conference if needed for a church to disaffiliate, if they really want to disaffiliate, so that it doesn't have to be done at the regularly called one. So you have till the end of 2023 to do that. She said, if there's a church that's very sincere in their desire to disaffiliate, we're not going to stop them from doing that. So that's kind of what's happening right now, that churches are in the process of disaffiliating. Not a lot in the Greater Northwest area that I've heard of, although it's expected that number will rise. A couple of annual conferences, I believe it was North Texas, it was one of the Texas ones, I believe it was North Texas, and also one in Europe, in the Russian area of Europe, very conservative. Those annual conferences voted that they were, as an annual conference, going to disaffiliate. Our Judicial Council has said that an annual conference can't disaffiliate, but individual congregations have. So that kind of threw a wrench into those plans of those annual conferences and the bishops of those annual conference. But in some annual conferences, there are a number of churches that are going through this. I just saw something pop up before I started this today on the Methodist News Service about in Georgia and Florida, there are a number of churches. There's one law firm that's working with a lot of churches, trying to take them through disaffiliation, trying to tell them they don't need to follow this process, that there are other ways to disaffiliate. So lots of court battles that are going to be happening in Georgia and Florida. To date, the Supreme Court has always upheld the trust clause and assumed that it will at this point as well, but some expensive battles going on there. In the meantime, that's General Conference, but in the meantime, we have, with the delay of General Conference, that also delayed jurisdictional conferences. So jurisdictional conferences that would have been held in 2020 and elected new bishops were postponed. We had 3 bishops who were set to retire. They were not allowed to retire. So they had to keep serving. Finally, in 2021, I don't remember which month it was, the jurisdictional conference is called a special jurisdictional conference for purposes of allowing those bishops that really needed to retire, because they have to be voted into retirement status through the jurisdictional conference. So at that point, Bishop Hoshibata from the Western jurisdiction retired, but Bishop Stanovsky and Bishop Bishop Hagia, who also were planning to retire in 2020, and Bishop Stanovsky had announced her retirement, they decided that they would continue to serve. I guess it was actually late in 2020 that this happened. Continue to serve until the jurisdictional could elect more bishops, because, you know, as bishops retire, there are annual conferences that now have to be served by bishops over other annual conferences or such. So Bishop Hagia, at the time that Bishop Hoshibata retired, Bishop Hagia took on both the CalPAC annual conference that he was a bishop of, and then also oversaw the Desert Southwest Conference. Now, when General Conference was delayed in 2022, it became problematic. There were more and more bishops that were they were at the point they were retiring. They just had to retire. But the Book of Discipline says that jurisdictional conferences can't meet until after a general conference is held. So we couldn't hold a jurisdictional conference to elect new bishops. What finally happened and it actually just happened in May of this year, the Judicial Council passed down a ruling saying, because this was an emergency situation and because the office of bishop was protected by the Constitution of the Church, that a special jurisdictional conference could be held before a general conference met to elect bishops, because otherwise the church had too many bishops that were retiring and there was no one to replace them. So it was announced that we would hold a jurisdictional conference in November of this year, November 2nd through 5th. The Western jurisdiction will meet in Salt Lake City, and the other jurisdictions will meet. They always meet at the same time, elect bishops at the same time. And in the front of the Book of Discipline, there's a list of bishops from starting with Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke down through the present day, and they're listed in the order that they are elected. So as they are elected, they're next on the list. And so if the North Central jurisdiction elects their bishop first, that's the first one in that class, and then they add on. And because of our time zone and our process, usually the Western jurisdiction bishops are the last ones elected. But they all meet at the same time. So that will happen in November. It'll be in Salt Lake City. I'm reserve delegate for our annual conference, so I'll be a part of that. We have for sure 3 bishops that we will be electing. Bishop Hoshibata, who's already retired, Bishop Hagia, and Bishop Stanovsky, who will be retiring. At the time I did this in June, also thought that Bishop Carcano would be retiring, because there is, I should have looked up the wording, it's not forced retirement, but you're required to retire at the end of the jurisdiction in which you turn a certain age. And she had turned that age, she will have turned that age by November 2022. So initially it was believed she would be forced to retire. Then the Judicial Council ruled that no, the original 2020 retirement date would be maintained. So she's not at mandatory retirement. That's the word I'm looking for. So she's not at mandatory retirement age. I'm not sure at this point. She has not indicated she's going to retire. So at this point, we're looking at probably electing 3 bishops in the Western jurisdiction. So that's where all that is, and hopefully we'll elect bishops. Things are still, the Global Methodist Church denomination has started. They have a few congregations that have joined them since May 1st, a few other congregations that are in the process of disaffiliating, and some will join them. The Global Methodist Church is, again, comes from the WCA group, which are these conservative groups of Good News Movement, Confessing Movement, and others that are upset that the church is becoming too progressive in their mindset and want to return to a much more traditional conservative understanding of Christianity. They say on their webpage that all are welcome, that their clergy will perform all marriages, but they also say that the only authentic marriage is between a man and a woman. So of course, same-sex marriage is not allowed. They also have language that LGBTQ persons cannot be clergy and cannot serve in certain roles in the church. So you're welcome, but you just can't serve. And, they also espouse in many ways that you're welcome, but you also need to change, and that you can change, going back to that language that was submitted in 72, that the church should be curing homosexuals. So that's kind of where things are right now. We kind of stand in the same chaos that we did before. I don't know the date or the location of 2024 General Conference, where it will meet. The fact that General Conference was postponed and not canceled means that at this point, the continuing understanding is that those who were elected delegates in 2020 will serve as the delegates to the conference when it meets in 2024. So I'm also reserved there, although much farther down on the list because we don't have as many delegates. One of the things in 2016, conservative groups really organized well and elected very conservative delegations. So when that 2016 General Conference met, that very conservative language was able to pass because they had really organized and filled delegations with conservative members. Progressives and moderates did that for 2020. So the 2020 delegation is going to be, at least from the US, is going to be much more moderate, much more progressive. One of my colleagues has said that based on his look at the roles with the folks he works with, their belief is that every jurisdiction in the US will have a much more progressive or moderate majority, so that the bishops elected in those areas will be mostly progressive and moderate, and that many of the bishops retiring in those areas are much more conservative. So we could see the bishops in the US at least become a little more progressive, a little more moderate, not necessarily of the worldwide church. And then what will the General Conference do in 2020? Not all of the WCA folks have left. Many of them want to stay to continue to drive the church toward a more pure Christianity. That's my language, probably not theirs. They still want to pass that protocol that would provide them with this big chunk of money, and then they'll go. So it's not like the WCA has formed, the conservatives have left, and now we have a progressive denomination that's left that's going to remove the incompatibility clause in that. We're going to have to see where it goes and what happens. The Christmas covenant that is being pushed by our annual conference and others keeps in one denomination, but allows each region much more control. This was attempted once before. It'll require some constitutional changes. That should stop. Tried once before, and once it was passed through the General Conference to change the Constitution, but once it went out to the annual conferences, the constitutional change never went through. But this is an attempt again to put the US kind of in its own region, Africa in its region, Europe in its own region, giving each region some control over these issues regionally rather than just by the worldwide church. So that may come out of it. It's just too early to know. Yeah, so I think that's kind of my update on where we are. You know, we've just been, from the start, we've been a denomination that's had many splinters and splits. This is nothing new, and this has been brewing since 1972. And as US culture has grown more progressive, as LGBTQI folks have gained more acceptance in our culture. As I said, probably 65% of the US delegates in 2019 were against the more restrictive move of the church, but those who want the more restrictive move have support from the overseas church, get that language, and they are controlling the denomination, but that's not controlling where the US as a whole is. So we still have kind of this this clash. General Conference should happen in 2024. Jurisdictional Conference should happen November of this year. Those churches that are moving toward disaffiliation have till the end of next year to try to do that. And you know, like I said, depending on the part of the country you're in, you'll see there's a lot of legal stuff that's going on around disaffiliation and churches wanting to go and take their property and not pay and do things. It's a fluid environment that changes all the time, and that's kind of where we are. And I know there's just a couple of you here, so I don't have the questions that we had the last time we met. I don't know if Rich remembers any of those, but just see if there's any questions on, or Rich, if you think of anything that I maybe left out that I talked about last time, let me know. So yeah, go ahead and have you unmute yourselves.
Okay, I think you've covered most everything that we talked about before, but I would like to kind of emphasize something that I think there was a little bit of confusion previously. And so the question would be, if a local church wants to stay in the UMC at this point in time, what do they need to do? Do we need to call a vote of the membership to show support, or is calling a vote only for those churches that want to disaffiliate with the UMC?
Yes, thank you. That's one of the things I should have emphasized more. So when I presented this in June, I was unclear with the disaffiliation language. And it's very clear in the disaffiliation language. The only reason you can disaffiliate is because you're upset with the language adopted in 2019, or you're upset because you can't just disaffiliate because you're upset with the church. It has to be over this issue. And the only action you can take is to disaffiliate. So there's not a vote to stay in the church, because you are in the church unless you have taken action to disaffiliate. There's no process to take a vote to stay in the United Methodist Church. There's only a process to take a vote to leave the United Methodist Church. So if you want to stay, there's nothing to do. You stay in the church. the process outlined in the Greater Northwest area to disaffiliate is that the very first thing that has to happen is a vote by a called charge conference presided over by the district superintendent, where at least 50% of the church, or the voting members of the charge conference, vote that we want to start the process of exploring disaffiliation. So until there's a significant number of folks in the church saying, we want to look at disaffiliation, there's not going to be a charge conference called. And until you think you have a vote close to 50%, there's not going to be a charge conference. If nobody's talking about it, if nobody's out saying, I want to disaffiliate, there's nothing to vote on. There's no reason to vote. If you have that charge conference and at least 50% vote to start the process, then the process, there's a couple parts of it I had bookmarked here on my webpage. Let me bring that up so I can talk about that if I didn't close that window. Is first you hold the all church conference to authorize the exploration of disaffiliation. You create a study team, and their job is to lead internal conversations and to get costs. You have to outline then through that work, you have to outline as a local church how you are being affected by this issue one way or the other, and how that is leading to your desire to disaffiliate. You work with the conference treasurer and others to get the cost, your share of the unfunded liability, your share of the apportionments and others, and continue to work with the district superintendent in this process. You share that through your church. When you've got all the information, when you've got your statement that everybody agrees on, and this is the reason we're leaving, and this is how it's affecting us and not allowing us to do effective ministry, so our choice, so we need to leave. Then you can, you'll ask the district superintendent when you're ready to call another charge conference to actually vote to disaffiliate. At that point, it takes a 2/3 vote to approve the motion to disaffiliate. A 2/3 vote of the professing members who are present. They can't vote by proxy, and you actually have to be a professing member. You actually have to have joined Whitney United Methodist Church to vote on this. So if it doesn't look like there's 2/3 of the congregation that wants to leave, there's not really a process to follow. But anyway, if you do have that vote and you vote that you want to disaffiliate, that proposal then is sent to the conference leadership. The conference treasurer prepares the information to go to the conference trustees and to the annual conference. And then the annual conference has to have that meeting. And as I said, the bishop has said she will call a special annual conference for that to happen before the December 31st, 2023 date. So if it's not ready to be voted on by June annual conference, it can be voted on by an October annual conference or even early December. And the annual conference votes. And if a simple majority of the annual conference votes then to allow X church to disaffiliate, you now make your payments, and then you are disaffiliated. And at that point, you are no longer a United Methodist congregation. You can no longer use the cross and flame because that's trademarked by the United Methodist Church. You are no longer covered by the 501c3 designation of the United Methodist Church, which is your nonprofit tax designation. So you need to get your own really quick, or else you are now a taxable entity. You're not covered by any of the protections of the United Methodist Church. Your clergy person, unless they have disaffiliated as well and stayed with you, your clergy person is no longer there. Their appointment is terminated. And just a number of other things happen. So that's the process. Ultimately, you have to have 2/3 of your members who want to disaffiliate. So unless there's I said it last time, there was really nothing to vote on till then. And some said, well, maybe we need to vote on whether we need to vote on to vote. I mean, unless there's a movement of folks who are clamoring for something, there's nothing to, you're not close to a 2/3 vote if nobody's talking about it. Somebody has to get up and make a motion that I want to disaffiliate for this reason. So that's the first step, I guess, is if there's somebody out there thinking they want to disaffiliate, they've got to start talking about it and talking to others and building that up. And I wasn't really prepared to talk about this too much last time because, there hasn't been, from what I've seen at Whitney, any, there's always unease over things with the denomination. That's from the start, but I haven't heard of this congregation that movement toward leaving the denomination. And I just can't imagine that 2/3 of the congregation is wanting to do that, but it's never been brought up or mentioned. So that's why I said there's really nothing to vote on. So as long as you want to remain United Methodist, you are United Methodist. Nothing changes that. Now that could change when the General Conference meets in 2024. They might adopt different legislation, and at that time there is a requirement to do something. But at this time, there's not. There is still out there the process of voting to become a reconciling congregation if the congregation wanted to do that, which would be you would remain United Methodist, but you would just vote that, you would just state that we are a United Methodist church that is a part of the reconciling movement that is advocating for full inclusion of LGBTQI persons in the church, that we are working toward that, that we welcome into our membership LGBTQI persons. That's an option out there for a vote. But there's really nothing to vote on disaffiliation, unless there's somebody who's saying, I want to disaffiliate, and there's enough in the congregation to do that. Then we can reach out to the district superintendent to say we need to have a meeting to vote on this. But I don't see that in Whitney unless there's this movement below the surface that I'm unaware of. I don't know if that helps, Rich. And again, I meant to mention with the Global Methodist Church, their beliefs, if you look at their website, and they have one, just Google Global Methodist Church. A lot of it will sound very much, the language comes from our Book of Discipline. It sounds very similar to the United Methodist Church. What they will claim, and what they are out stirring up a lot, is that they're saying, we're leaving the United Methodist Church because the United Methodist Church, you've got bishops and clergy who don't believe in the Bible. You've got bishops and clergy who don't believe these things, and they're teaching opposite things. And we're the true believers on this, and they aren't. And it's true that there are clergy who have, and lay people who have different views on scripture and that. Actually, from the time of Wesley, there's been a great deal of latitude in that. So that's not new. But there's a lot of, I've been reading different things of the GMC is putting out, some groups of the GMC are putting out a lot of, I guess, what I'd call disinformation on those of us who are remaining United Methodist. And don't believe everything you read. They'd probably say the same thing about me and what I say about them. So there we are. Anything else, Rich? I can't think of anything else I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to wrap it up there. If anybody does see this and has questions about something that I haven't talked about, or want to know more about something I talked about, please let me know. I'd be happy to provide what information I can. Right now it's just kind of a waiting game, and it's a big question mark out there where things will go and where the denomination will go. I think a split is still a possibility, but I don't know. So. Okay, well, thanks for joining me this afternoon. Have a great rest of your day.